I've lived on this land for over 70 years. Now I farm in partnership with my son Dan, who lives on another farm quite close by. And together we have about 800 acres. Nowadays we produce mainly wheat and some barley and rape, and about a quarter of the land is used for cattle. We're farming land now that used to be 5 separate holdings when I first came on the scene. In those days, farming was much more varied. We had a great variety of crops and livestock. Now it's changed, as has the countryside and the people. The first job of the day is to go and look. It used to be said that farmers' feet make the best dung, which meant that crops are best on the farms where the farmer constantly walked around his land to see what was going on. A major part of the farmer's job is observation. Watching livestock is particularly important. Anything can happen. If an animal is off its grub, the reason has to be discovered at once. If it wanders off by itself, there's something wrong. Occasionally the worst has happened. They have broken the fence and got out of the field and must be found. My son Dan comes in every morning to have a cup of coffee with me, and we talk about our plans for the day and what's been happening. Those prices, Dan, were a little bit disappointing yesterday.
How much were they?
The top one was 93 for the heifer,
Yeah.
and 88 for the next one.
What do they all add up to?
I haven't worked it out. Wait for the ticket. But you can work it out.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, we were, without a doubt, top of the market. It's just the whole trade was down. The average for the ordinary cows was around about 72, 73, so we're well over the average.
Well, what do they make then?
88,
Yeah.
the one, that's the big cow,
Yeah.
and 93, the heifer.
Right, should we see if Grandpa's awake? I bet Grandpa's awake. He's always awake for us.
It's quite a large family house, and we had 6 children. By the time my wife died, they'd all left home, and I was here by myself. But then my youngest daughter and her husband, who are both teachers, came back with their 2 children to live with me.
Want Mummy to put it on there? Yeah.
No, Mum.
Okay. Where do you want it?
Daha.
Grove Farm is just outside Chesham, right on the borders of Bucks and Herts. It's in the Chilterns. On this ordinary bit of land, which you can see duplicated 1,000 times in Britain, you can demonstrate all the changes that have taken place anywhere in the countryside this century. They've all happened here in this small area around Grove Farm. This is the B4505, the road that leads to the Grove. It shows a sharp division between land that's been developed and the land that's remained in agriculture. This wasn't planned, but resulted from the economic situation of 2 different farmers in the 20s. One man failed, and the land was sold for building. The other prospered and modernized, and so opened out the land as it is today. I've seen all this happen, and I thought it was worth recording before there was nobody left who remembers it as it was. I was inspired and encouraged to start tape recording my own experiences and my own picture of what the countryside was like by this book, which I bought in a second-hand bookshop in Aylesbury. It was dictated, not written, by a man called John Wilkins at the end of the last century. And he had been a gamekeeper all his life, most of it in Chesham. And it played a great part in encouraging me to record what was going on. The story we're telling is the story of the changes in farming and in the countryside in one man's life, my life. And in that 70 years or so, the changes have been more than in the previous 400 years. This is Grove Lane, an ordinary country lane with low-trimmed hedges. It's not that way in my memory. The hedges used to be thick and high, so you would only glimpse the small fields behind, each one with its own name and its own secrets. This is a map of this immediate area, part of the parish of Chesham, which shows the position, plan of the fields, etc., as it was in the 1840s. It shows a most extraordinarily complex plan of fields, all shapes and sizes, and remarkably small in this immediate area. The names of the fields shown, many of them tie up with documents we've got going back a long way. For instance, there's one field shown here as Wethered's, and that was given by John Partridge, who lived in this house, to his daughter when she married Edmund Wethered of Ashley Green in 1585. Next door to that is Two Dells Field, which is James and William Dell, who owned that land at the end of the 16th, the beginning of the 17th century. So a lot of names tie up with very early ownership. I expect motorists think this refers to the two dips in the road. It doesn't. It's James and William again. This field is 36 acres, and we still call it Wethered's. 400 years ago, it was 6 or 7 fields with 3 different owners. I turned it into one. Of those original owners, one's name is still attached to the field, passed down by word of mouth, another to the road that passes by, and the third has been forgotten. This is a situation in which one feels particularly split, if you like. First of all, there's an extremely good crop of wheat, which I'm proud of, on land which used to be considered poor land. So I feel very happy about that. But then, again, nostalgia comes in. This was originally 5 or 6 small fields, high hedges, each field with its own name and its own separate secrets, including a small field over in that direction, which was full of wild daffodils every spring, so as a child I used to go and pick them. And I swept it all away, and I feel nostalgia about it. On the other hand, it's also been quite inevitable, the pressure to produce food. I was only doing what everybody else in the country is doing, but this particular part of landscape, I've ruined if it is ruined. I've also improved if it's improved. So I take personal responsibility for it and have personal regrets. This small bit of country shows things much as they were 70 years ago, a patchwork of small fields unspoiled, and the farming unimproved. Here the wood is only half the size it used to be, and the only hedge is newly planted. You can still see the white lines where some of the original hedges were that I removed. Some things didn't change for a long time. From the Middle Ages right up until the time when I started, there was nothing more efficient than one man with a plough and a team working 100 acres, which is why in the Doomsday Book, land was measured by the hide. The hide is 100 acres.
You plough an acre a day with one of these here, and a 9-inch furrow, you walk 11 miles.
What did it feel like, Will, being behind a pair of horses again after 40 years?
Oh, lovely.
Did you enjoy it?
Yes, yes. Like it was in the old days. I mean, you used to enjoy yourself.
It reminded you of a lot of things, I expect.
I've got a photo here. I'd like you to see, but... No, that is one ploughing.
Yes, one ploughing, Will. Where was that taken?
Just over the edge there.
Well, that's way back. You were pretty young then. Will Barnett was the horseman on this farm.
Early one morning, the break of the day, for the cocks were crowing, the farmers did say, come ride, you young fellows, come ride with good will, for your horses want something, their bellies to fill. Oh, harness your horses and rub them down well, for I'll give you a jug of my bonny brown ale.
It was lovely. After they'd been to church on a Sunday, you'd hear them singing away and whistling. You'd always hear them singing and whistling. Whistling, most You'd never pass anybody, a farm labourer, I think, that you heard him whistle or sing.
It was the first World War broke out, you see, when I was 11. And I went back on the September the 1st to start school, and I've been there 3 days when some inspector come round. He said, how old was I? I said, 11. Well, he said, any boy over 11, which is past standard 6 at school, which was the top standard, could leave and go to work on the farm. So, of course, up goes my hand. Tom Reed's 11 to the 19th of August. And he said, well, start, so I went, started. 5 to 5, lived in, the old girl Bergen kept us and give us £6 a week.
When we was young lads, we used to go with the men in the field, and they used to let you have a go ploughing and that there, and that's how you learned.
I told you, I was going along, you know, we used to go from one field to the other. We put an old bit of wood on what we call the straddle iron, so it wasn't on the shower, it was sliding along this bit of wood. I hollered woe to the old horses, you seen the plough fell ass overhead, on top of me. So I couldn't lift it off, it was too heavy. So I'd wait till the next chap come along with his pair of horses, lift the plough off of me.
You used to come out at 7 in the morning with horses, and then you used to go ploughing till 9:30. A big lump of bread and cheese or meat, a lump of cake, a bottle of tea. Well, you used to have it at 9:30. I used to carry a gun in the basket for shooting rabbits or anything I could get out on.
In the village of Whelpley Hill, everybody used to know each other. Tom Reed is in his 80s now, and his mother used to work for my mother. His nephew, Benny Baldwin, is the publican, and his mother used to look after me when I was a little boy.
Tony was the governor, yeah. He was a different type of man altogether. He was born a gentleman. I was only a farm labourer. I wasn't in his class, was I? How could I be? When he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, and I was born with a pot of soup.
Will Barnett came from Lincolnshire. He started work for me as soon as I began farming and remained with me for 50 years.
Well, when I first started for Tony, he won 20. And I worked for him for 50 years. We was, as you might say, like mates, because we used to work together. I mean, he's worked from daylight to dark when he first started.
He married a local girl, Flo Batchelor, and her father worked at Grove Farm as a horseman since the turn of the century.
The village of Whelpley Hill, near where we lived, you was just like one big happy family. And before those registered nurses, my mother used to bring the babies into the world. When anybody died, she used to go and lay them out.
Florence Batchelor was at school with Vi Plested, the daughter of a horseman and hedger on the next door farm to us. And Vi married my wife's brother.
I used to so admire your mother. She was the first woman I ever saw who'd got makeup on, but she was a very attractive woman, wasn't she? A very lovely woman. Big built and lovely clothes. Oh, I used to think when I get older I'll have the same.
All the people we've spoken to are in some way related or connected with each other, because it used to be a very small community, all working on the land, all related to each other. 200 years ago, my family were farmers too. Then almost every family in Britain worked on the land. We found in the chest there 4 generations of family photographs. That's my mother in, I think, about 1910. And then there's also this picture of me looking rather a lot different from today. I was 12 years old when that was taken. Looking surprisingly clean and neat. My father was a businessman who decided to come and live in this area. I don't know precisely why, because I was only 8 years old when he died. He had been quite successful in his business. I think he always wanted to farm. neither his father nor his grandfather were farmers, but his great-grandfather was in Sussex, and I think he always dreamed of being able to farm. So he moved into the area as one of the very first commuters. And I was born only 400 yards from where I live now, in this house where he had a small farm. When I was 8, I became intrigued with the idea of plant breeding, influenced by Mr. Newland. The first effort was in crossing different colours of polyanthus, because they were so very obvious in the early spring. With no great success, I might say. I went on from them to potatoes later the same year, and I grew all the varieties of potatoes I could find, of different colours and shapes and sizes, with a view to crossing them. I went on from that to birds and animals. And by the time I was 9, I was well into breeding chickens and rabbits, both of which in those days came in an enormous variety of shapes and sizes. Chickens weren't, as now, just machines for producing eggs or meat. They came with legs enormously long, legs very short, with tails trailing into the mud, feathers on their legs, feathers on the top of their head, all sorts of weird shapes, sizes and colours. And there were societies which went in for showing them in every small town, including Chesham. In the very earliest days, with no water except what collected in the moat, only a few animals could be kept. 5 working horses, 2 cows and a pig. But it wasn't the practical things that I first noticed about the Grove. Before my father had bought this farm, it seemed to us as children quite a mysterious place. We couldn't see it. It was surrounded by trees and everything, and reputed ruins inside. And I remember my brother, when I was very small, taking me during the school holidays. And we were frightened of the farmer who owned it, or rather occupied it. Benny Wingrove was a very bad-tempered man. So we crawled through the willow bushes to have a look. And the first thing I saw was a privy hanging over the moat, a 3-seater privy, just like something you read about in American backwoods stories. 3 seats side by side with heart-shaped holes cut in the doors, 2 full-sized ones for Mr. and Mrs. and the child's one next door, hanging over the side of the moat, and I know exactly where it was. I could go there to this day. When I first started to record my memories, I realized how vivid the first ones are. I discovered that whenever I had a few minutes to myself, I could speak my thoughts into a tape recorder, and they wouldn't be lost. When I first remember this house, it was in use as a barn, and the trees had crowded very closely around it, and it was more or less derelict. The first thing I remember was heaps of walnuts on the floor, drying, ready for sale at Christmas time. After that, it was used alternately for livestock, pigs, and then a bull, and then sorting potatoes, and occasionally the storage of grain. It wasn't until the 1960s that we converted it back into a house, which is what it had originally been without any shadow of doubt. It used to be called the chapel, and may have been one for a time. It certainly looked like one, and so the locals said it was haunted and wouldn't visit it after dark. They were astonished when we went to live in it. From 1 year after my father died until I took it over, this farm was managed by a man called George Larkin, who was really typical of a whole class of people. He was a lay preacher of a sort of blood and thunder variety on Sundays, although a very humane and kindly man in every other way. He worked with great energy, and he used to tell me that he could work harder than all the other men because the Lord was on his side. And I think he was exhausted by the end of the week and glad to just go to chapel. To me, he was just like he'd been recently demobilized from Cromwell's new model army. He had the same sort of standards that they must have had. I think George Larkin would have recognized the way my neighbor Maurice Brown farms, because he's doing it much as we were all doing it in the 20s.
Yeah, we keep the old scythe as a memento of the old hard-working days,
Yeah.
isn't it?
I suppose, like the rest of us, you used it for cutting round before cutting with a binder.
Oh, yes, yes.
As well as for grass cutting.
Yes.
It's hard work.
It was hard work.
Yes, a
In
rotten
fact-
job.
but
Something that I
it's,
was particularly no good at, 'cause I'm too tall.
I was about 17 when I started,
Yeah.
and it was so hard that it brought tears to my eyes
Yes, I quite believe it.
with the continual swish,
Yeah, yeah.
swish, all day long.
It was hard work.
It was hard.
There was only one thing that was worse, and that's this thing, which some people use for the same job.
Yes.
And which I myself, on one occasion at least, have cut a whole field of peas with one other man. Right down like this, all day. And that's the way it was all done originally. And if you stood up, you were supposed to be lazy. So at the end of the day, you couldn't stand up, and somebody had to put their knees in the middle of your back and pull you up straight. All the wheat and barley grown anywhere in the world was cut with one like this. And from biblical times and onwards, the same thing, exactly, right up to our time. In 1804, Arthur Young rode around this area, surveying and farming in Hertfordshire for the Board of Agriculture. Indeed, he visited the farm next door to mine. He saw the newly improved countryside of the agricultural revolution. When I first saw the same countryside a century later, it was almost unaltered except for the decline in standards due to the long depression of the 19th century. The sheep which had maintained the fertility had gone. The hedges had been left untrimmed, the crops were not weeded, and the life of the people on the farms was hard. Arthur Young described in detail what he saw, and the local system of chalk mining particularly impressed him. The land itself on the surface is acid, but only 20 or 30 feet down there is chalk which will correct the acidity. For many hundreds of years, chalk pits were dug all over the place, and most of these little groups of trees you see, very small woods, nearly all of them represent where chalk was dug, and then the land couldn't be cultivated afterwards, so trees sprung up, just as they are here, just as they are over there, just as they are there, all over the place. A landscape dotted with small spinneys and groups of trees, all of which represent somebody mining chalk at some period in the last 500 years. The chalk was spread around the field from wheelbarrows pushed by women. Young approved of this because it didn't wear out the horses. Apparently, the women didn't matter. Almost every field had at least one chalk pit of its own, and those which remain can easily be seen from the air as small clumps of trees. After chalking, other things had to be done to improve fertility. The basis of farming in this area for a very long period had been trading hay and straw into London because you hadn't got the stock to eat it yourself, for cab horses and dray horses in London, and bringing dung out on the same vehicle. And more important than that, really, was bringing human waste out from London to use on farms around here. And then the arrival of the canal in Berkhamsted in the 18th century offered enormous chances of improving fertility, and all the human waste from London came out and was used in the home counties as manure. And people now who get excited about the organic farming having died out and being replaced by chemicals should realize it happened not because the farmers wanted it to happen. They were perfectly happy to use shit, if that's the word, from humans living in London. It was the public health authorities which stopped it happening. Otherwise we would have continued, and of course there would have been much less loss of fertility from the land if everything had been returned to it. So canal transport and fertilization revolutionized farming in the 18th century. Another change was in farm machinery. It happens that some old farm implements have been preserved on a nearby farm at Ivinghoe, and I went there with Will Barnett to see them.
And as all these old-fashioned buildings really weren't much use to us any longer, I said they could have it here if they wanted. And so that's how we came to have this collection. Temporary, it was meant to be.
Jeff Hawkins, the farmer, showed us round.
This is the drill we used to use, or this type, on the farm here. It's a Bedfordshire drill, made by Browns at Leighton Buzzard. And I've been lately surprised at the enormous age of it. Well, of this design. There's a print I saw of 1810, and it shows Hensman's patent drill.
However skilled a man was at sewing by hand, there was a variation in how he did it, and an enormous variation between men. Whatever man went out with this, if you got the cups right and the drill set right, he drilled at the same rate. So you brought a bit of science in it, you knew how many pounds per acre you wanted to sow, and for the first time you could do that.
You put your seed in there, and these here go round, and the seed drops down there and comes out the bottom.
See, you can have big cups or little cups, You can fill half of them up with soap,
Yes.
we used to do,
Yeah.
to reduce your rate of seeding. So it's infinitely adaptable, using what the maker supplies and also using your own common sense. But if we wanted half the rate of seed, that's what we used to do. Put a bit of soap in half the cups and hope it didn't fall out too soon.
Well, you can take that one out, you see, and that one, and then you've got a wider row. You just drill with these in, take these off altogether.
Jethro Tull made the first corn drill. Mid-18th century, went bankrupt in the process, I'm told. I don't know, but and that really has enabled the enormous expansion of grain growing all over the world. It's not conceivable that new countries could have opened up without some form of drill. It all dates from that, and the principle to this day is identical. Let's go and have a look at the seed barrow outside. If the implements and methods in use when I came into farming had developed in the 18th century, the people who worked them had remained stuck in the 19th century. The men working on the farms were almost in two classes in a way. Those doing the supervision, the foremen and the farmers, were mostly staunch nonconformists and rather rigid in their attitude, going to chapel every Sunday and not drinking very much. The men who were working them, for them, their lives revolved around beer mostly. They were lowly paid, poorly housed, not too healthy, and the pub and the beer was the most important element in their lives.
See, when we started hay-making with you see, you could go and get a pint of beer at 6 o'clock in the morning up at the door. You got a pint every 2 hours until 10 o'clock at night. If you was a man, of course I was only a boy, so I used to have a bottle of ginger beer. But the men could have a pint every 2 hours.
Very early in my life, I came strongly under the influence of somebody called Alf Newland. He came from Norfolk. He was my father's gardener, but also looked after the few cows, pigs and poultry. And he was a very knowledgeable man in all sorts of ways, and very contemptuous of Buckinghamshire farming, in particular of the way Grove Farm was farmed. In Norfolk, everything was done better. But combined with this, he was also a frightful snob, because everybody he'd worked for in Norfolk was called Squire something or other, and lived in something or other hall. He was a Methodist lay preacher, and he was by way of being a radical in politics. And I remember him telling me, God gave the land to the people. And I thought at the time, I'm glad God gave my father some. Why did he give so much to Mr. Lowndes and Lord Chesham? And why didn't he give Alf Newland, who spends every Sunday of his life preaching in Lay Hill Chapel, any at all? Doesn't seem quite right to me. For me, the countryside is like a canvas with one picture drawn on top of another. The picture when I appeared on the scene was one of 16th century field names and villages, 18th century methods, and with 19th century people living in it. Each pattern imposed on the last, nothing completely lost.
Early one morning, the break of the day, for the cocks were crowing, the farmers did say, come rise, you young fellows, come rise with good will, for your horses want something their bellies to fill. With a bit in my pocket, I swear and I vow, you all idle fellows that follows the plough. We have ploughed an acre, you've told a dull lie. We have ploughed an acre, I swear and I vow, for we all jolly fellows that follows the plough.